Maniac at Large brings the chills to our quiet libraries. Directed by John Frankenheimer, written by Mae Woods, shot by John R. Leonetti, and music by Bill Conti. Based on a story from Crime Suspense Stories number 27, drawn by George Evans. Nobody is who they seem in this killer's profile. It's a busy day at the library, and a killer is on the loose in the city, who has already claimed 7 victims. Mrs. Pritchard, the head librarian, deals with some young troublemakers.
What's going on here? You're defacing public property. Rub that out, right now.
No.
What was that?
No eraser.
How dare you behave in here like you do in school? Grady, escort these boys out of the library. They may return when they're ready to act like civilized youngsters.
Yeah, Grady, take us out.
Margaret is visibly uncomfortable with the commotion, and with the unknown murderer. She pockets the knife left behind by the kids, and makes awkward eye contact with the reader. It's Blanche's first day working at the library. She has a terrible feeling that something awful will happen to her. After all, there is a maniac at large. Her boss, Mrs. Pitchford, suggests they both stay late after closing, so Blanche can learn how to file the cards. Mrs. Pitchford goes out to get them some food, and leaves Blanche locked in the library with the last patron of the day. Blanche feels uneasy about this, but starts returning books to the shelves. She feels the man's eyes watching her as she works. As she's about to place her last book, she is startled by a headline on the newspaper rack. Maniac still at large. Blanche knows she will be victim 8. Grady, the security guard, tells Margaret he doesn't like Mrs. Pritchard. The boss lady calls Margaret to her office, where she's warned not to distract Grady from his security duties. Pritchard has Margaret work late tonight on inventory. Margaret is hard at work, logging and organizing books. She gets spooked by a man asking to check out a book. He makes small talk about the serial killer's patterns, which concern Margaret.
Now, serial killers are hunters looking for a particular kind of victim. Not our killer. His victims have got nothing in common, apart from the fact they're all men. That's pure coincidence, really. I have a theory about his next victim. Interesting. You ought to be. Because the next one's going to be a woman.
He keeps talking, even following Margaret into the employees-only area. He finally leaves when Pritchard shows up. Margaret is in the dark basement. Her imagination runs wild about killers with knives, so she runs to Grady. He looks for any would-be killers.
They found my stash.
It's only Margaret and Grady in the basement, and he gets a little creepy himself. Margaret rushes to Mrs. Pritchard, who is talking to a police lieutenant about an earlier theft. Margaret stresses the killer is in the basement. Nothing is in the basement, only some vandalized books. The lieutenant bids Margaret and Pritchard goodnight. Margaret expresses her concerns about Grady's on-the-job drinking, but her boss is well aware. Mrs. Pritchard announces the library will be closing soon. She calls Grady to the office, and Margaret hears them argue. Grady storms out of the library, and Mrs. Pritchard also leaves to bring back food. Margaret is terrified of being left alone. Pritchard gives Margaret her keys to lock up once everyone has left. One reader is still in the library, the serial killer fan. Margaret feels uneasy with him. She tells him to leave and refuses his advances to stay with her until Mrs. Pritchard returns. She lets him out before locking the door once more. Margaret's mind is in a frenzy, terrified at the possibility of being the city's next victim. The man in the library approaches Blanche, who is scared out of her mind. He offers to stay with her until Mrs. Pitchford comes back, but she declines. He has no hard feelings for her refusing. He realizes the entire town is in a panic. The man checks his book out and insists he stay. She is adamant that it isn't necessary. He leaves, the door locks behind him, his footsteps echo away from the library. Blanche is alone until another set of footsteps comes closer to the door. She prays it's Mrs. Pitchford returning, but it's another man. She yells at him through the glass to go away. The library is closed. The man holds up a book, pointing to the printed due date. He's trying to avoid a late fee. Blanche doesn't know what to do. She tells him to come back tomorrow. The man is not happy with this and begins knocking on the glass door. Blanche lowers the shade. Her heart pounds in fear. She hears the man walk away. The window man in the show is way more theatrical. I've never seen anyone so desperate to return a library book. The anxiety compounds when Margaret sets off the alarm. Once the blaring sound stops, she hears Mrs. Pritchard return. Blanche peers through the window shade and sees Mrs. Pitchford approach with coffee and sandwiches. The ladies couldn't be happier to see their boss's familiar face. Trying to catch their breaths, Margaret and Blanche unload all their fears to the head librarian. That she was afraid either of the two men could have been the maniac killer, but she is assured there was nothing to worry about. The man staying late is there every night, and the man with the overdue book works late and is always given an exception. And as for the killer being a man, who's to say that it isn't in fact a woman? As she lowers the window shade, Mrs. Pitchford details her theory that the killer is a woman. All the victims so far have been men, and she believes if the murderer were to suddenly switch to killing women, it would throw the police off her trail. Mrs. Pitchford offers Blanche a coffee, but she refuses. Blanche believes Mrs. Pitchford is the maniac at large, and demands she keep her distance. Margaret has her theory about Mrs. Pritchard as well.
Where's Grady? You sent him away, didn't you? Maybe you killed him.
What?
Yeah, you hated him. You hate everyone. You said yourself that people get what they deserve. When you think he deserved to die.
You think I'm the murderer?
Now you want to kill me?
Oh, that's ridiculous.
Don't touch me! Don't touch me!
Blanche is in panic mode. Mrs. Pitchford tries to come near her, but for Blanche, it's kill or be killed, and she chooses to kill. Without thinking, she wraps her hands around Mrs. Pitchford's neck and squeezes as tight as she can. It isn't long before Mrs. Pitchford's body becomes lifeless. Margaret uses the knife from before to defend herself.
Just like all the others! Like all the others! But I'm not afraid anymore. I showed you!
Grady walks in at a most opportune moment as Margaret gives her formal resignation. Blanche calmly walks out of the library, feeling safe once again. She saved herself from the maniac killer by killing them before she could fall victim, just as she has done 7 times before. While the structure of the two maniacs at large are very similar, I greatly prefer the comic. The narration panels allow us to experience the paranoia and eventual twist along with Blanche's point of view. The external nature of the episode makes a lot of the fear feel more like workplace drama. I also think it's creepier knowing that Blanche will continue her delusions out in the world. Despite his shock, I feel like Grady would call the cops and put an end to Margaret's reign of terror while she's still lost in her head. The actors are good, the opening tracking shot is amazing, showing all the killer possibilities, and the guy banging on the window would scare anyone in real life. Even if I wish the episode took us on a trip into Margaret's head, Maniac at Large is still worth checking out from the library.